It was supposed to be an ordinary day. That's what Malcolm Reed told himself as he sat in the defendant's chair, wrists shackled in cold steel, heart pounding so hard he swore it echoed in his ears. His breathing was shallow, his palms damp, though his hands had long since gone numb. Across the room, 12 strangers watched him with varying degrees of suspicion, judgment, and indifference. Their gazes felt like heavy stones pressed against his skin. He wasn't supposed to be here. Malcolm Reed. The judge's deep voice rang out, measured and final. You have been found guilty of armed robbery. This court sentences you to 60 years in state prison, without the possibility of parole. 60 years. Behind him, his mother gasped, sharp and guttural, like someone had punched the air from her lungs. His sister, Nicole, let out a broken sob that sliced through the silence like shattered glass. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He sat there, frozen in disbelief, as his life collapsed around him like a house built on sand. They had no real evidence. A blurry surveillance video that barely showed a face. An eyewitness who hesitated before pointing him out in a police lineup. And a public defender who was drowning in caseloads and had no time or will to fight for him. None of that mattered. Judge Harlan Monroe barely looked in his direction before he slammed the gavel down and moved on to the next case. To him, Malcolm wasn't a person. He was a number on a docket. Another statistic to file away in a system that thrived on keeping its machine running smoothly. But what Judge Monroe didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Malcolm Reed was innocent, and the real criminal was still walking free. And so, Malcolm's nightmare began. Part 1, a life stolen. The cold reality of prison hit harder than any sentence ever could. On his first night, Malcolm lay on a thin, hard mattress, staring at a ceiling stained yellow with age. The stale air smelled of sweat, rust, and hopelessness. Around him, metal doors slammed. Voices echoed through endless halls. Somewhere, a man screamed and someone else laughed. Malcolm stayed silent, motionless, trying to believe it wasn't happening. But every scrape of fabric against his skin, every breath in his lungs, reminded him he was here. Locked away. Trapped. He thought of his mother's face when they led him away in chains. Of Nicole's cry. Of the way the world seemed to vanish behind the slam of that heavy door. He had been home that night. Alone. Watching television. There were no witnesses to vouch for him. No cameras to prove he never left his apartment. Only his word. And his word wasn't enough. He remembered the prosecutor's cold, practiced words. The suspect entered the convenience store wearing a black hoodie, gloves, and a mask. He pointed a firearm at the cashier and demanded the contents of the register. He fled with over $33,000. A lie. Every word. The man in the surveillance video had his build, maybe even his height. But the mask obscured everything. The video was grainy and dark. It could have been anyone. But when they asked the eyewitness to identify him, the old man with trembling hands and cloudy glasses hesitated. Yeah, that's him, he said. I think. That's all it took. The judge overruled the weak objection from Malcolm's public defender and moved forward as if it were fact. The trial was over before it even began. The jury took less than 4 hours. Guilty. Part 2. Surviving the sentence. 60 years. An entire lifetime stripped away with the stroke of a pen. Malcolm tried not to think about it. Not to count the days and years he would lose. Not to wonder how many holidays would pass without him. How many milestones Nicole's kids would reach while he was locked away. He tried not to imagine his mother aging without him by her side. But prison doesn't let you forget. Time hung on his shoulders like a weight that grew heavier with every second. The days blurred. Breakfasts of gray, tasteless mush. Guards who didn't look him in the eye. Inmates who watched him closely, weighing him like meat in a butcher's shop. Malcolm kept to himself. Head down. No friends, no enemies. Just survival. Until survival wasn't enough. One afternoon in the yard, they came for him. A group of men, bigger, meaner, angry at the world. They circled him near the fence. You don't belong here, one of them said, cracking his knuckles. Malcolm stayed silent. He knew better. The first punch came fast. He hit the dirt. More fists followed. Boots to ribs, knuckles to jaw. By the time the guards arrived, it was over. No one cared why it happened. No one asked. Later, alone in his cell, face swollen and body aching, Malcolm stared at the concrete wall. He thought about giving up, about letting this place turn him into someone else. Someone hollow, someone angry. But then he thought about his mother, about Nicole, about the life that had been stolen from him, and the freedom he still dreamed of, even if it seemed impossible. Malcolm Reed wasn't a criminal. But in here, that didn't mean a thing. Part 3. The Judge's Reckoning. Judge Harlan Monroe had never questioned his own verdicts. He believed in the system, in the law, in himself. Once the gavel fell, his work was done. But something about Malcolm's case lingered. Maybe it was the young man's silence when the sentence was handed down. Not silence born from defiance or anger, but from knowing. As if he knew nothing he said would change his fate. Or maybe it was the letter. 3 years later, long after Malcolm Reed had disappeared into a prison cell, an envelope arrived on Monroe's desk. No return address. Inside was a letter from Jamie Bowen, a public defender not assigned to Malcolm's case, but one who had taken an interest. Judge Monroe, it began, there's something you need to see. Attached was a report and a name. Dante Briggs, a career criminal, multiple convictions, a known gang member, and the man who, during questioning on another charge, confessed to the very robbery that had landed Malcolm in prison. I did it, Briggs said in a statement. I hit the place. Thought it was an easy score. The confession had been buried, lost in bureaucratic chaos, never sent to the defense, never flagged for review. Monroe's hands trembled as he read. He had sentenced an innocent man. Part 4, a broken system. Fixing his mistake should have been simple. But it wasn't. The district attorney's office dismissed him. The jury made their decision. They said, the case is closed. Monroe showed them the confession. Happens all the time, they said. Criminals lie to cut deals. But what if this one wasn't lying? Monroe pushed. Filed motions. Each was denied. Not enough evidence, they ruled. No new trial warranted. So he went public. The media picked up the story. Judge seeks to overturn wrongful conviction. That's when the warnings started. Quiet first. Fellow judges, this isn't your fight. You're undermining the system. But Monroe wouldn't back down. He filed for an emergency hearing. And 5 years after Malcolm Reed had been locked away, he walked back into court. Part 5. The Fight for Freedom. Malcolm sat in the courtroom, his wrists free, but the weight of 5 years bore down heavier than any shackles. He didn't trust this moment. He'd long stopped believing in hope. Across the room, Judge Monroe sat still, the same gavel in his hand. But something in his eyes had changed. Nicole sat behind Malcolm, her hand clenched in their mother's. Both of them braced for more heartbreak. The district attorney wasn't giving up. There's no reason to reopen this case, they argued. This confession is unreliable. Malcolm's new defender stood. Calm, steady. The real danger, she said, is not reopening this case. The real danger is leaving an innocent man in prison because we're too proud to admit we were wrong. The courtroom stilled. Monroe inhaled slowly. 5 years ago, he began, I sentenced Malcolm Reed to 60 years. I believed I was delivering justice. I was wrong. A hush rippled through the room. This court grants the motion for retrial, Monroe said, and vacates the conviction of Malcolm Reed. Malcolm didn't move. Couldn't. It felt like someone else's life. But then Nicole's arms were around him, his mother crying into his shoulder. The guards who had once escorted him in cuffs stood uncertain as Malcolm walked out the front doors of the courthouse. Free. Epilogue. A system on trial. Judge Monroe remained seated long after the courtroom emptied. He had spent a career believing in the justice system. Now he saw it clearly. How many more had been buried under the weight of rushed decisions? How many more Malcolms were still behind bars, waiting for a truth that might never come? This wasn't just Malcolm Reed's story. It was the story of thousands. of a system that values conviction rates over the truth, that fears admitting failure more than it fears condemning the innocent. And the next innocent man might not be a stranger. It might be your brother, your son, your father,